Welcome to Politically Georgia from the Atlanta Journal-Constitution. I'm Greg Bluestein here with Tia Mitchell. Hey, Tia.
Hello.
And we're getting ready for what is expected to be a major speech by President Donald Trump. He's going to deliver a nationally televised White House address Thursday night. And while it's still unclear exactly what he plans to say, Georgia politicians, they're already bracing for the fallout. Trump is expected to revive false claims about the 2020 election and raise new allegations of election interference. He might also invoke Georgia, but Georgia Democrats aren't waiting for Trump to reveal his hand. Senators Jon Ossoff, Raphael, Warnock, they both launched preemptive attacks, framing any new challenge to Georgia's election results as an attack on the voters who elected them. And Republicans are also uneasy about where the speech could lead, especially worried that Senate nominee Mike Collins' repeated false claims that Trump carried Georgia in 2020 could come back to bite them. So today we're looking at why both parties are reacting before Trump has even spoken and how another fight over 2020 could shape Georgia's biggest races in 2026 all over again. Tia, let's start with the emergency press conference that you covered that Jon Ossoff held on Tuesday. Let's listen to his main message here.
The President of the United States tried to commit voter fraud in Georgia when he badgered Brad Raffensperger to, quote, find him the exact number of votes he needed to win in a state he had lost in 2020. He is reheating debunked conspiracy theories and launching bizarre new lies because he fears losing these midterm elections.
Tia, you were at that emergency press conference. Well, it was streamed live on cable news networks like MS Now. It made a huge impact.
Yeah, and I think we should be clear. Ossoff is not working on any inside intelligence. He does not know what the president's going to say. He's looking at the speculation and reading, the AJC and other media outlets. So I don't want us to read into it that he has some inside track. But what he is doing is trying to get out front of whatever the president might say. He's taking advantage of the fact that, as you mentioned in the intro, it is potentially problematic, that it could really make voters outraged and in Georgia have impact because Georgia has been the epicenter of Trump's, complaints about the 2020 election, even 6 years later. So Ossoff knows that, and he's saying, you know what? I'm going to speak out. Warnock has too, but to a lesser extent. Of course, Warnock is not the one on the ballot in November. So we do see that Senator Ossoff, not just that he's taking advantage, but as you noted, the media is saying, if this guy's talking, we need to listen. So every major network, they didn't all take it live, but I will tell you, they were all there filming at that press conference on Tuesday. And again, even beyond Georgia, there's just a lot of consternation about where he might go.
Yeah. And okay, so the consternation started a couple of days ago when a Twitter account got a lot of traction claiming that the president would declare Senators Ossoff and Warnock illegitimately elected. And since then, that Twitter account ended up retracting it, saying that they were being told that Trump wouldn't say that. Either way, we know Trump, because Trump has acknowledged himself, we know Trump will bring up election interference in 2020 issues. And I think also the reason why Senators Ossoff and Warnock are taking this so seriously is because the president remains somewhat obsessed, if not single-minded, over his election defeat in Georgia in 2020. He's brought it up again and again and again. It's become something of a litmus test, at least for politicians in Georgia, to win his endorsement, to sort of parrot or echo those election fraud claims, those false election fraud claims of widespread election fraud in the 2020 election. We have to always remind folks it's been debunked. These conspiracy theories have been reviewed and vetted and debunked time and time again. Even Republican leading officials in Georgia and nationally have said there's no evidence of any such widespread voting fraud in Georgia that would change the outcome of President Trump's defeat here. And yet it still remains this sort of litmus test. And Tia, there is this sense, not just from Democrats, but Republicans as well here in Georgia, and I think in Washington too, of here we go again.
Right. And, there's this sense that the president truly is beating a dead horse, because even if he found something improper, which we, again, have no idea what he's going to say in his speech, but even if he were to find something improper, he cannot invalidate an election that's already been certified, right? Once it's done, it's done. Now, if someone
and Senator Warnock has already won re-election.
And Warnock even won re-election again in 2022. So even if you thought Warnock was illegitimate in 2020, the president so far has not questioned the 2022 election. I think we should also say, we've been, me and our colleague Caleb Groves have been doing a lot of reporting on this, and Caleb's been talking to a lot of sources. And again, we do know that there was the seizing of the ballots in Fulton County. We do know that the Department of Justice, the Department of National Intelligence, at Trump's direction, has been looking into Georgia's election, combing through documents. There were even some FBI analysts. MS Now reported that they quit because they felt like they were being forced to make something shake that wasn't there. And they felt that it violated laws and rules and ethics. But like you said, it's going to be so problematic because I think even conservatives that we've been talking to as we've been reporting on this story are like, we don't think there will be anything there. So Trump is possibly going to embarrass us or create new conspiracies that dilute turnout among Republicans while increasing engagement and turnout among Democrats. That did not work well for Kelly Loeffler and David Perdue in 2020 and in those runoffs in January 2021.
Yeah, let's talk about the Republican side of the coin first. I was talking with a senior Republican official who's very sympathetic toward Trump, and kind of bought into some of these claims in 2021 and 2022, but has since sort of abandoned them, saying, what else can be looked at? This is the most scrutinized election in Georgia history, at least modern Georgia history. Like what else could these officials be vetting? What other documents could come out? We've had court cases. We've had a years-long election interference probe by Fulton County DA Fonnie Willis. On the other side, on the Republican side, we've had this surge of FBI agents ordered by the Trump administration and his allies and the FBI to go vet these documents. And what else could we find? And, I know, both Republican campaigns and the marquee races for Senate and governor, they know they've got to win a significant number of middle of the road voters to win. It's no longer looking at like it was maybe 10 years ago, okay, just win the base and we'll win the election. They've got to win these independent swing voters. Many of them, according to polls and of course our own interviews, are tired of 2020. They want to look forward. They want to look beyond the 2020 election. So Rick Jackson's, he's having his first major post-runoff general election campaign rally up in the North Georgia mountains. And guess what it is? It is Thursday night, right before the Trump speech. There, I know folks around him are worried that Trump's impending remarks will overshadow whatever it is Rick Jackson's message is going to be that night. He's going to have to answer questions about how he feels about whatever Trump is about to say. And of course, you've got Mike Collins, and Tia, you've reported a lot on his views of the 2020 election. He's called it a rigged election. He's called it a federal hijacking in his 2022 bid for Congress. And just the other day, he told a CNN reporter that Trump won the 2020 vote.
Yes, that is all true for Mike Collins. And that is partially why Ossoff is going big on this issue, because for him, it's a through line. To him, it talks about where Trump is focused and not on voters. But also he's saying it's dragging Collins into something where Collins now has to defend Donald Trump. Because yes, if you ask Mike Collins about the 2020 election, he will repeat that he thinks it was fraudulent. He thinks it was stolen. He kind of parrots whatever Donald Trump has been saying about the 2020 election. But that is not what Mike Collins wants to be talking about. That is not his agenda. That's an agenda that kind of gets forced on him because Donald Trump continues to talk about the 2020 election. So, it puts Mike Collins in a tough spot where he feels like he wants to be loyal to Trump. And so if asked, or if it's the news of the day, which it is right now, he aligns himself with Trump. But I think his team knows that that is not what's on top of mind for voters. Affordability, the economy, the price of goods and gas, that is the number one issue. That's what they've tried to pivot their campaign on. But Trump is not allowing that to happen. And again, Ossoff is jumping on that and saying, see, look what my opponent is focused on, where he and Donald Trump should be focused on the things you care about. So it is putting Mike Collins, particularly Mike Collins. I think Rick Jackson, and you can correct me if I'm wrong because you cover him much more than I do, but Rick Jackson, yes, he supports Donald Trump, but he's not Donald Trump's pal. You know, he was not endorsed by Donald Trump. There's not as much pressure to be loyal. So yes, Rick Jackson will be asked and will have to answer to it, of course, as the Republican Party's nominee, but he's not as closely tied to Trump as Mike Collins.
Yeah, he says he'll be Trump's favorite governor and that he is like Donald Trump with a Southern tone. So he's definitely aligning himself with the president, but you're right, he didn't get Trump's endorsement. He wasn't running as like the Trump-blessed candidate doing the nomination fight. My guess is Rick Jackson, when I ask him about it, when we press him about it at that rally Thursday night, he'll say something like, well, there's questions that need to be answered and we'll look into those. He'll kind of try to sidestep whatever the president will say because he won't know exactly what the president will say. He'll have seen the media reports, but we still don't know exactly what President Trump intends to say about Georgia doing this address. It's interesting too, Tia, because there was a time when Democrats might want to also not sidestep this, but not come as aggressively out against these planned remarks, right? There was a time when Democrats would just say, oh, deja vu all over again. How many times do we have to relitigate this? But instead, we're seeing preemptive strikes, both from Ossoff and Warnock. Very strong statements you talked about from Ossoff, also from Senator Warnock. They both have good reason to do so because they feel like, and Democrats feel like, this is only going to backfire. This is only going to help mobilize their coalitions, with Senator Warnock wanting to be, or at least positioning himself to be in the 2028 conversation. He can come out as one of the leading critics of the president's obsession with his home state. And of course, for Senator Ossoff, who needs to galvanize Democrats as well and needs to also win those middle-of-the-road voters, his message that if he is called illegitimately elected, then it is also a direct indictment of Georgia voters. That's a powerful message to go bring middle-of-the-road voters as well in the run-up to November.
Yeah, I agree. And I do think a difference, you know, when you think about Joe Biden running for president in 2020, and quite frankly, throughout Joe Biden's 4 years as president, he made a big focus talking about preserving democracy, saving democracy, fixing what Donald Trump broke. And in a lot of ways, people said, you know, that wasn't an effective message. It seemed tone deaf. It did not align with, again, the concerns about the economy that we're hearing from voters. So what we're seeing from Ossoff and Warnock, which is to me indicative of how Democrats are handling the issue, is they're not just saying, look at Donald Trump wanting to overturn the election. They're saying, look at Donald Trump wanting to overturn the election instead of focusing on the things that are important to you. Or look at Donald Trump trying to overturn an election that was 6 years ago and validating your voice and your vote. And if he thinks the election was illegitimate, he thinks you as a Georgia voter are illegitimate. So they're kind of, you know, instead of making it a one-step process, making it a multiple-step process to make sure their message or attempt to make their message resonate more with voters and tie in more with things that voters either care about or that kind of makes an emotional connection. So I think they are applying some lessons learned from what didn't land under President Biden to try to make these attacks on Trump stick. But I think even Democrats would say they are concerned about possibly being perceived as focusing too much on Trump because they don't want voters to say, hey, you know, we might disagree with Trump. We might think Trump says some things that are problematic or downright wrong. We still want you to focus on the economy and lowering costs and helping improve the job outlook. We don't want you to get distracted by Trump. And I think Democrats are trying to make sure they don't cross that line and get on the other side of where voters are.
Yeah, interesting. They're pairing the high-minded defense of democracy we heard so much about in 2023, 2024 with the micro concerns about pocketbook economics that was the big criticism of the Democrats' battle in 2024, that they weren't talking as much about that. Okay, let's take a quick break. When we come back, we're going to talk about why we probably won't see runoffs this election cycle. This is Politically Georgia from the Atlanta Journal-Constitution. Welcome back to Politically Georgia. I'm Greg Bluestein here with Washington Bureau Chief Tia Mitchell. If you love Politically Georgia, the best way to support us is by subscribing to the AJC. Your subscription makes this podcast possible because it pays for our salaries and it hooks you up with full access to our reporting, exclusive newsletters, event invites, and article gifting for your friends. Start your subscription right now at ajc.com/start. Georgia may have just avoided another holiday runoff season. The Libertarian Party of Georgia said this week it failed to collect the more than 70,000 signatures needed to place its statewide candidates on the November ballot. That means voters won't see a Libertarian option in the races for governor, U.S. Senate, or other statewide offices. And the practical effect there is significant. It means the contest between Republican Rick Jackson and Democratic Keisha Lance Bottoms for governor and Democratic Senator John Ossoff and Republican Congressman Mike Collins for Senate are now far more likely to be decided on November 3rd than any overtime. And here's why. Georgia requires statewide candidates to win an outright majority, not simply finish first. Libertarians never come close to winning in Georgia, but in a tight race, even 1 or 2% of the vote can prevent either major party candidate from crossing 50% and forcing the top two into a runoff. And Tia, we've seen plenty of these runoffs reshape Georgia politics before.
Yeah, and I think the absence of a Libertarian candidate in particular really changes the general election, because we know in Georgia, again, they don't come anywhere close to winning, but usually they are a few percentage points, and that in a swing state like Georgia, where the Republicans or the Democrats are usually separated by only a few percentage points, having that third candidate, that third kind of higher profile candidate often does force the runoff, as you mentioned. And the Libertarians not making the ballot, I think, helps Ossoff avoid a runoff where, everyone expects him to get the most votes in November. Mm-hmm. But we know once you get to a runoff, things become risky, all bets are off. Sometimes that second place winner manages to pull it through. So I think Ossoff's team would like to avoid a runoff.
Yeah, and there's always a debate about who it helps and who it hurts. And there's valid arguments for helping Ossoff or helping Collins or whoever, because, traditionally you think that Libertarian voters are more likely to vote Republican. But there are some Libertarian voters who could be more left-leaning and just sort of hands-off government folks. And then there's the very good case that many folks say, many Libertarians themselves make, which is they were more likely not to vote for anyone, that the Libertarian option gave them the only option they want to pursue, right? They wouldn't vote for either of the major party contenders because they don't believe in either of those platforms. And so, the 1 to 2% of those votes, that they can split up in a range of ways. But the practical implication, of course, we're talking about is no overtime. But there is a deeper implication of this too, which is it means fewer options for Georgians on the ballot. They're going to be divided between these two candidates. And the reason we say we can't completely rule out a runoff is because there's still an option for write-ins. So let's say a write-in candidate gets a significant portion of the vote. They still could push this race into a runoff, but that is very, very unlikely given the small number of write-in votes in previous Georgia elections.
Yeah, and there's just no high-profile write-in campaign that's really catching fire, that's really going to get more than, a few dozen or maybe a few hundred, It's the Libertarian that in the previous statewide elections has been the difference maker in forcing a runoff. And particularly, I wouldn't say it was just any Libertarian. Chase Oliver was like the guy for the Libertarian Party in Georgia, and he was able to build a following, build name recognition. And when he's on the ballot, enough people have seen him around, like his message, that, again, he doesn't get an insignificant portion of the electorate enough to be a spoiler and force that runoff.
Yeah, I mean, it was Chase Oliver who won 2% of the vote back in 2022, forcing that race into a runoff. Of course, Senator Warnock ultimately won that race. Oliver also was the Libertarian presidential nominee in 2024, and he did not meet the threshold. He did not get the votes needed in order to guarantee himself a spot on Georgia's ballot. State law says that third-party candidates must win at least 1% of the vote in a statewide election to automatically qualify. He got 0.4% of the vote in Georgia in 2024. He was going to run for governor. Again, this cycle ended up dropping out, pulling himself out of the candidacy a few weeks ago. But there's a long, long history, not just for Chase Oliver, but for libertarians to shake things up. I mean, it goes back decades, but in 92, Libertarian Jim Hudson, he won about 3% of the vote. That prevented Wyche Fowler, the incumbent Democrat, from an outright victory. And then it was Paul Coverdale who ultimately won that runoff. And then it was Shane Hazel back in 2020 who won enough votes to barely prevent David Perdue from winning the election. I mean, David Perdue came within a whisker of an outright win. That, of course, triggered the January 2021 runoff that John Ossoff won that we're talking about here today. So that changed the course of Georgia politics. There was Jim Martin. There's been a number of libertarian-influenced elections that changed a lot in Georgia.
Right. And I think we'll continue to study like the impact of libertarians on Georgia politics, if you will. But the takeaway this year is just for people to realize that is not the case this year.
Yeah.
And that makes the calculus for both Ossoff and Collins, and to a lesser extent, Jackson, well, I guess to a same extent, Jackson and Bottoms, you can't think about the likelihood of a runoff is kind of off the table. And I do feel like in 2020 and 2021, and quite frankly, with Warnock in 2022, they had to keep that in mind, that this is likely to go to a runoff. You can't spend all your resources. You can't, peter out because you're going to have overtime. But now I think there's just a little bit different campaign strategy when the likelihood of a runoff isn't there.
That's exactly right, Tia. I mean, it does change the entire makeup of these campaigns when they know that there will be no overtime. And this was a possibility throughout the whole year. So this is no surprise to the campaigns and their top strategists. I mean, we have been reporting that this was likely late last year because getting 70,000 signatures takes a lot of resources, takes a lot of, in some cases, a lot of money if you really want to put effort and organization behind it and, air ads. And there's lots of different things a party or a campaign can do. And the Libertarian Party was just not there this cycle. But yeah, there is no overtime. So you've got to go all out. And I can tell you in 2022, both campaigns were basically eyeing the next round. They kind of figured this would go into some sort of overtime between Warnock and Walker. In 2020, that was definitely the strategy for Senator Ossoff. His strategists were very, very skeptical of him winning outright, with David Perdue being this powerful incumbent with Trump's endorsement in the November ballot in 2020. So depriving him of that 50% was their top priority, and then going all in on the next phase of the vote where hundreds of millions more were spent over a 9-week runoff. We only have 4-week runoffs now, but we no longer have to worry about campaigns, at least this cycle, spilling out over Thanksgiving or spilling out over Christmas or New Year's like it did in 2020. So we will continue to track the ramifications of that. But yeah, you're right, Tia. That just means overwhelming odds are, November 3rd will be the end date of this campaign rather than any sort of overtime stretch.
Yeah, agreed.
Well, that's going to do it for today's edition of Politically Georgia. If you found us on YouTube, welcome to our new channel, and please click the subscribe button so you never miss an episode. And if you've got a question you'd like to ask us here on Politically Georgia, you can call our hotline anytime, day or night, leave a question, and we'll play it back and answer it right here on the show during our Monday mailbag segment. The number is 770-810-5297. We'll talk to you next time on Politically Georgia from the Atlanta Journal-Constitution.
Thanks for listening to the Politically Georgia podcast. Our executive producer is Shane Backler. AJC's head of audio is Sam Stamler. Production support from our partners at Goat Rodeo, including Kara Schillen, Hazel Hoffman, and Max Johnston. For more of our political coverage, visit ajc.com/politicallygeorgia, and we invite you to support local journalism by subscribing to the AJC. Join us again next time on Politically Georgia from the Atlanta Journal-Constitution.